Hi, this is Guy Wallace. I started in learning and development way back in 1979, and I semi-retired in 2023. But my current mission as a semi-retired L&D professional is to help enterprise learning and development organizations become more performance-based. Welcome to my podcast. This episode is all about alignment with the enterprise leaders to ensure that you're working on what Rummler called the CBIs, the critical business issues. Way back in the Caddy Spring 1999 Pursuing Performance newsletter, I looked at the concept of learning by design versus learning by chance from a systems standpoint, the leadership, core, and support processes that must exist for L&D to contribute and not take from the enterprise bottom line. That 1999 newsletter article, which I'll share the URL to in the show notes, was one of my many precursor writings leading to the 2001 publication of my third book, T&D Systems View. Yeah, back then I hadn't really converted from training to learning, which started back in the early 1990s with the publication of Peter Senge's book, The Fifth Discipline, which was all about the learning organization. I had begun writing my book back in the early 1990s in response to a colleague at ISPI, which was NSPI back then, who remarked in passing at the conference that ISD was more than curriculum architecture design. Yeah, I already knew that. In fact, the ISD function, called training and now learning, was more than just ISD, or today LXD, at any level. It was the systems engineering level of curriculum architecture design, or the product engineering level of ADDIE or SAM or Agile or whatever it is that you're calling that level of effort, where you're producing instructional content, either performance guides and or learning experiences. The book was also based on my work with AT&T Network Systems back in 1987 through 1994, and the alignment mechanism I helped my clients create with their internal clients and stakeholders. And my work back then was greatly influenced by the work of my business partner at the time, the late Ray Svensson. One key aspect of learning by design versus learning by chance is the collaboration needed between customers and suppliers to make informed, strategic decisions about getting certain business situations improved and in better control. Yeah, it's not about controlling everything, only those factors that are critical enough to the business, and therefore to the business of L&D, to warrant helping them keeping it all together and in line. Now, my primary focus is performance-based enterprise learning and development, and I'll continue with LXD and L&D, formerly known as ISD and T&D, as my focus in this podcast, which is on the people systems that I call governance, advisory, and project steering. Although I can see now that if I drop the word project, the acronym would be GAS, G-A-S, for governance, advisory, and steering, which would be the fuel that powers performance-based enterprise L&D and enable it to have impact back on the job, in the work processes, and on the bottom line. Learning by design for impact requires understanding the interrelationships between all three levels of these three people systems. Back in 2003, I had done an encore presentation at ISPI based on my 2002 presentation, which had been rated as one of the top 10 sessions of the conference, over 250 sessions that year. So I know it resonated way back then, and I hope it resonates today in early 2025. One caveat: one size seldom fits all. And aligning to the voice of the customer at three levels is no exception. That was the title of my session. In fact, there are many more or fewer levels to align to, depending on the scope and complexity of your situation, of your context. Adopt what you can and adapt or even reject the rest. That's one of my mottos. I've been doing it my entire career. You should too. So let's dive deep into the three people systems I call governance, advisory, and steering or project steering. These are the central driving force behind the strategies for business-based L&D. If your L&D strategy isn't driven by the governance system, I'm sorry, but you simply won't be aligned. And if you do get aligned, can you keep it aligned? These systems or levels organize the key stakeholders of the enterprise and formalize the channels of communication. They provide the forum for L&D's internal marketplace customers to provide advice and give the organization's executive-level leadership governing power over L&D strategies, tactics, and resource allocations. If you're like many of us in the business, figuring out what needs to be developed and deployed is typically a decision for the L&D department to make itself. But you may have run into a downside lately. Many different customers have been coming to you with multiple and conflicting priorities, and you don't have enough staff or other resources to meet those expectations. You also may not have the clout or support to go to the big bosses and make a legitimate case for more ISD, LXD, headcount, and budget. Today, more and more companies, led by a new breed of L&D professionals, are replacing a learning by chance approach to L&D decision-making with a systematically thought-through system that collaboratively designs value into the organization's learning activities and returns from those investments. Where the ISD professional engages key stakeholders in the key decision-making processes, appropriately doing L&D development efforts that are linked to specific knowledge and skills that have been systematically derived as being required for successful performance, not just nice-to-know topics and learning games off the top of somebody's head. Training resource allocation decisions should always be based on improving the enterprise's bottom line. Otherwise, why bother? Resource decisions can become no-brainers. If that favorite presentation skills workshop isn't working, its maintenance efforts should get shelved for the higher gap L&D priorities that will return their weight in gold or something close to that. Where should training dollars be spent? On developing 15 new salespeople to sell to emerging Pacific Rim markets with $50 billion in new business? Or on that new course on feel-good interpersonal communications for the entire payroll of 32,000 people? If you were the single shareholder, where would you invest? The power behind learning by design is the structure that governs the L&D decision-making processes. It begins in the governance and advisory systems and processes and the interplay between those two groups. While not always formal, the system consists of three components, the first two of which are permanent structures for a formal approach and/or just relationships for an informal approach. Or it's a blend. A governance board, typically composed of executives of the enterprise, sanctions the overall L&D approach and allocates resources based on the needs of the business and the strategies and advice from the groups below, the advisory councils, which are appointed by members of the governance board. The advisory councils represent their own domains, engineering, sales, marketing, for example. They provide advice to the governance board as it decides where to expend the limited resources allocated to L&D and then steer L&D efforts within their areas of interest after resourcing. The third level is temporary, only existing for the duration of the project's needs. These are the steering teams temporarily put in place to support development and deployment, in my case via my PAC processes for performance-based instruction, including both performance guides and learning experiences. The steering level may include project steering teams, analysis teams, design teams, and any other support teams that a curriculum architecture design project or my ADDIE-like modular curriculum development projects require. They are formed as part of a packed project, do their work, and then disband once the project is complete. Project steering team members are appointed by the advisory council, who then in turn handpick all the other project-related team members for analysis teams or design teams or the combination of analysis/design teams. As always, it depends. Back to the top. The governance system and processes ensure communications with the executives of the enterprise for the purpose of directing and resourcing L&D systems and project efforts. Their focus is usually not on the low-hanging fruit with mass appeal, nor is their bias to fill empty classroom seats or online seats with employees who need a place to sit. We call this butts in seats or butts on sites, as both are only measures of the lowest of the low-hanging fruit metrics. The only way to ensure that L&D systems are addressing the business-critical and highly important high-payback L&D is to systematically engage the leaders of the enterprise to double-check the findings of the advisory councils who provide investment recommendations to the governance council. It builds confidence that L&D expenditures are investments with plenty of returns to follow, as in ROI, or economic value add, or cost-benefit analyses. Ideally, this governance board or council includes at least a few of the most senior executives of the enterprise. These are the folks who understand the strategic direction of the business. When they make L&D decisions, they base them on how L&D can help align the people resources with what needs to be done enterprise-wide, process-wide. This board doesn't try to use L&D to make up for bad organizational structures, poor communications, bad processes, or any other quality impacting element except for the knowledge and skills that keep people from performing at optimal levels. A formal governance board may typically meet twice a year, depending on the volatility of their business situation. The first meeting is in sync with the enterprise budget cycle. The second, 6 months after, is used to review and make any mid-course corrections. Things are always changing, aren't they? So would the priorities. Members rotate on and off, but still represent the key business functions or processes. An informal approach is to meet more casually to get to the same input. That less formal approach will work if your supplier-customer situation is not very complex, if your enterprise is smaller. The next level is the advisory system and processes. The formal advisory system and processes is also for communications. It would include a set of committees or councils immediately below the resource allocating, decision-making governance board. Think of them as communities of practice from the knowledge management world. Advisory councils look out for the more parochial L&D needs of their individual functions and processes owned by their functions. They could also be organized differently depending on the nature of the enterprise. How these councils are structured and the number of them depends largely on the organization and how it operates. Ideally, they should represent functions and disciplines and cover the leadership core and support business processes, depending on where the critical business issues currently exist. Don't form groups when they aren't dead center in the priority targets. Examples include advisory councils for marketing and sales, engineering or merchandising, manufacturing or operations, human resources, finance, services, etc. Take a look at how your enterprise is currently organized. Those organizational entities own their processes, and that's what you would be helping to improve, the process performance of the whole enterprise by improving the process performance of the people performing in those processes. The formal advisory council meetings might occur before each of the governance board meetings, or would be held at least twice a year, or perhaps more often, quarterly. If approached informally, the functional leaders should be met with prior to the meetings with the enterprise leadership so that you have the needs input to set final priorities established to make the resource allocation decisions. Now to the third level, temporary project support teams. Almost all of my conducting projects going back to 1982 used a team approach to producing or acquiring L&D. Now, I don't advocate teams just for the sake of including people so they'll feel good about the process, but because the critical L&D needs of the organization are best addressed when the right people are involved in the right manner at the right time, doing the right things in analysis, design, development, and or decision-making needed in the architecture and development of methodologies and technologies. Membership in the temporary support teams is determined by the specific criteria and plans for the particular LXD project. Project steering teams are different from analysis or design teams. The key here is that the most valuable contributors to these temporary teams will be the busiest ones in the organization, and getting them is difficult, unless they are appointed by the leaders in their functions and disciplines, and then their time must be used judiciously. It's always easier to obtain their help when they know that theirs is a temporary assignment with a start and end point. In summary, the governance, advisory, and project steering systems and processes and the people are the glue that hold a high-impact L&D system together and get it aligned, and just as importantly, keep it aligned. They provide the cross-organizational knowledge that identifies real business performance needs. They prioritize these needs and sanction which projects do and do not get resourced from among all of the training or learning needs that might exist. I believe that the more complex the enterprise customers for L&D, the more complex the L&D function suppliers need to be in terms of their interactions with them. The more formal your approach should be getting these critical communication channels in place and operating efficiently and effectively. Most importantly, effectively. This has been all about my preferred approach for facilitating the voice of the customer as well as the voice of the supplier in getting communications clarity regarding smart business decisions being made quickly to the benefit of all, but mostly to the enterprise leaders and the shareholders whose equity would be invested. My context was as an external L&D consultant, offering performance-based instructional architecture and development services to large firms and agencies. So again, my caveat, one size seldom fits all, and aligning to the voice of the customer at 3 levels is no exception. In fact, there may be more or fewer levels to align to, depending on the scope and complexity of your situation. Again, adopt what you can and adapt or reject the rest. Thank you.